The war at sea during 1914-18 was chiefly between two great fleets, Britain's Royal Navy and the German Imperial Navy. It took in most of the world's oceans. It also saw the introduction of weapons which were to revolutionize naval tactics. In time of war, navies have had two objectives: to destroy the enemy's battle fleet and to cut maritime communications. The two sides went to war in 1914 with these aims very much in mind. Today's major navies tend to be built around aircraft carriers. In 1914, however, it was the battleship which ruled the roost. It was the largest type of warship afloat and had the biggest guns. The battleship had, though, gone through a major change in the years before 1914. At the turn of the century, this type of battleship had guns of several different sizes, typically 4 12-inch in the main turrets, with smaller guns along the sides. The idea was that it could simultaneously engage different types of warship and from all angles. The devastating Japanese naval victory over the Russians in the Tsushima Straits during their war of 1904-05 revealed that it was the largest caliber guns which had inflicted the damage. This resulted in the development of the all-big gun battleship, the Dreadnought, called after the British vessel which began this new type. She was given 10 12-inch guns, with just a few lighter weapons for close defense. The weight of explosive which she could fire made all other battleships obsolete overnight. The Germans, keen to have a navy as strong as that of Britain, embarked on a massive shipbuilding program. Thus began the so-called Dreadnought Race, an arms race which led to increasing tension between the two countries. By 1914, the Germans had a fleet of 13 Dreadnought-type battleships against the Royal Navy's 21. Other navies also built dreadnoughts. In 1914, America and France had 10 each, Russia and Japan 6, and Italy 4. Gun size also increased from the 12-inch guns of the original HMS Dreadnought to the massive 15-inch guns of HMS Queen Elizabeth, which entered British service on the eve of war. Her guns had a range of more than 8 miles, 3 times that of the pre-dreadnoughts. Even so, naval engagements were still limited to the range of optical instruments, and would be throughout the war. The Queen Elizabeth was also significant in that she was one of the first warships to use oil rather than coal. This gave her greater range. Supporting the battleships were cruisers, which had 2 roles. They were the fleet's scouts, but also had to protect the battleships from attack by torpedo boat destroyers. The Dreadnought had considerably higher speed than the old-style battleship, so much so that it outstripped the existing cruisers. The British, therefore, in 1908, launched a new class of vessel, the battle cruiser, fast and with guns only slightly less powerful than the Dreadnought. In order to achieve high speeds, some armored protection was sacrificed, but not on the German versions, which were also known as armored cruisers. It was a sacrifice that the British would later have cause to regret. But battle cruisers were expensive to build, and for Britain especially, whose navy ranged over every ocean, there was a need for a vessel which would dominate the more remote seas. Consequently, the light cruiser was developed in tandem with the battle cruiser. Again, other navies followed this trend. A naval weapon which had been developed during the second half of the 19th century was the torpedo. By the 1880s, small torpedo boats, capable of high speeds, had come into service as a means of delivering this weapon. In order to protect capital ships from this threat, the torpedo boat destroyer was introduced. This became the third main element of the battle fleet, and soon took on other roles as well, including reconnaissance and as a torpedo launcher in its own right. Torpedoes had a theoretical range of over 5 miles, but were seldom fired at more than 1,000 yards from the target, in order to have a good chance of hitting it. The other threat to ships besides guns and torpedoes was the mine. In its modern sense, it had first been used by the Russians in 1855 during the Crimean War. By 1914, the standard type had horns, which, if struck by a ship, detonated the explosive charge. Mines could be laid by submarine or surface ship. To clear mines, minesweepers came into service. At first, these were often converted fishing trawlers, which operated in pairs with a cable to cut the mine from its mooring slung between vessels. Once this had been done, the mine was destroyed by rifle fire. At the outbreak of war in 1914, the opposing fleets deployed to their wartime bases. The Royal Navy, still very much the world's largest, had 2 such fleets, the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands and the Mediterranean Fleet, based at Malta. It also had squadrons in the West Indies and South Atlantic, and could call on the small New Zealand and Australian navies. The French agreed with their British ally to concentrate on the Mediterranean, using their base at Toulon. This enabled the British to reinforce their Grand Fleet in home waters against the German High Seas Fleet, based at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven. In the Mediterranean, the Austro-Hungarian Navy was based at the head of the Adriatic. But its ships had to pass through the narrow straits of Otranto, which were easy to blockade. The same situation applied in the Black Sea, where exit for Russian ships into the Mediterranean could only be via the Dardanelles, controlled by Turkey. Within the Black Sea, however, the Russian fleet completely outnumbered the Turks. Russia, too, had another fleet in the Baltic, but its activities were severely restricted by the German presence there. The Germans also had a squadron in the Far East, based on their small Chinese colony of Tsingtao. This, though, had to face the powerful fleet of Japan, another British ally, most of whose ships had been built in that country. The British plan was to contain the German High Seas Fleet in the North Sea by bottling up the Straits of Dover and using the Grand Fleet's destroyers to patrol from the Orkneys to the Norwegian coast. The British fleet also trailed its coat off the Baltic coast to tempt the German High Seas Fleet out of port. But at first, the Germans refused the bait, although individual vessels did slip through the British patrols to lay mines. The Germans also sent out U-boats to keep a watch on the Grand Fleet should it leave port. Likewise, the British sent submarines into the Baltic. There were a number of minor clashes in the North Sea, which culminated in a British destroyer and light cruiser raid on Heligoland at the end of August. In this, the Germans lost 3 light cruisers and a destroyer sunk. Away from home waters, the Germans had a number of warships at sea at the outbreak of war. 2 of these were the cruisers Gerben and Breslau. They'd been given orders to bombard Algiers in order to interrupt the passage of French colonial troops to France. They were then told to go at once to Turkey. But their commander nonetheless bombarded Algiers early on 4th of August, and then set off to run the gauntlet of the British and French fleets. That his ships were able to do so reflected poor coordination between the British and the French and hesitancy among the naval commanders. The arrival of these 2 ships at Constantinople did much to foster pre-war German efforts to bring Turkey onto her side. Efforts which had included a visit by the Kaiser, who is seen here with Turkish officials. A more significant overseas German naval force was the Far East Squadron under Admiral Graf von Spee. One of its ships, the light cruiser Emden, was dispatched to the Indian Ocean to harry shipping during the early months of the war. During her cruise, she sank a Russian cruiser, a French destroyer, and 16 merchant vessels, before being surprised and sunk in the Cocos Islands by this cruiser, the Australian Navy's Sydney. The remainder of the Far East Squadron had orders to disrupt Allied trade in the Pacific. Von Spee steamed to South America, causing chaos on the trade routes. A British squadron based on the Falkland Islands met him on the 1st of November off the Chilean coast. 2 of its ships, these elderly cruisers, Monmouth and Good Hope, were sunk. The British gained their revenge when Admiral Sturdy, with 2 modern battle cruisers, destroyed the Germans in an action off the Falklands in early December. Back in the North Sea, the Germans adopted a new tactic, tweaking the British lion's tail by carrying out bombardments of seaside resorts on the English east coast. This was the first time for more than a century that civilians had been killed on British soil as a result of enemy action. In January 1915, however, there was a serious clash in the North Sea off the Dogger Bank. Intercepting German radio signals that their battle cruisers were making a foray, Admiral Beatty and his first battle squadron of 5 battle cruisers intercepted and engaged 4 German ships. Beatty's flagship, HMS Lion, was hit several times and badly damaged, but the German battle cruiser Seydlitz had 2 turrets destroyed. Worse, the Blücher was sufficiently struck to slow her. She was then engaged by 4 British ships, which sank her with nearly 800 of her crew. The plan to send an expedition to the Dardanelles was spearheaded by the Royal Navy, especially Winston Churchill, its ministerial head. The eventual plan was to support Russia against the Turks by forcing an entry into the Black Sea and threatening Constantinople. A military force was gathered. In the meantime, British and French warships began in mid-February 1915 to subdue the Turkish forts guarding the Narrows. Bad weather and mines, however, hampered operations, the latter accounting for 3 battleships and seriously damaging a number of other vessels. Trawlers sent in to sweep the mines also suffered from the fire of the forts. Although the forts themselves were silenced, the mines were considered too dangerous to risk any more capital ships, and the landings themselves had to take place at the Mediterranean end of the Dardanelles. Troops went ashore on the 25th of April from lighters and a converted steamer, the River Clyde. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops took part. Those from the last 2 countries became known as Anzacs, short for the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. An expedition which had, however, started with high hopes, soon degenerated into a bloody stalemate. Further landings were made in June, but with no decisive result. Additional troops were sent out from Britain, but still the deadlock remained, with casualties through enemy action and disease continuing to rise. The supporting warships did their best to help by bombarding the Turkish positions, but were unable directly to influence the land battle. Eventually, in January 1916, the troops were evacuated, perhaps the most successful operation in the whole campaign, with not a single man being lost. Elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the Italian entry into the war in May 1915 helped to keep the Austro-Hungarian fleet largely bottled up in the northern Adriatic. The Italian fleet carried out a number of bombardments of the Balkan coast, a large part of which was held by the Austrians. While they caused much damage, they had little effect on operations in the region. German and Austrian submarines often managed to slip out into the Mediterranean, in spite of Allied efforts to prevent them. Surface vessels also tried to do the same, not always successfully. On the 10th of June 1918, an Italian torpedo boat successfully attacked the Austrian battleship St. Stephan. The crew seemed numbed by the results of this sudden disaster. Many failed to get clear of the ship in time and were sucked down with her. In January 1916, a new commander, Admiral Reinhard von Scheer, took over the German High Seas Fleet. He resumed raids on the English east coast. Then, after the Germans had called off their unrestricted U-boat campaign in early May for fear of provoking American entry into the war, he drew up a plan designed to trap and destroy elements of the British Grand Fleet. This called for battle cruisers to trail their coats off the Norwegian coast in order to tempt Admiral Beatty's battle cruisers out from their base at Rosyth. The German dreadnoughts would then destroy them before the main body of the Grand Fleet under Sir John Jellicoe could arrive from Scapa Flow. Jellicoe sensed from an intercepted radio signal that the Germans were up to something and decided to preempt it by taking his fleet to sea on the 30th of May 1916. The Grand Fleet was at full strength, with 24 modern battleships. Jellicoe ordered Beatty to rendezvous with him on the following afternoon. Beatty set sail from his base in the Firth of Forth with 6 battlecruisers and a supporting squadron of 4 battleships, plus escorting cruisers and destroyers. Significantly, watching U-boats did not realize that the whole fleet was at sea. The Germans sailed in the early hours of the 31st, with Admiral Hipper's 5 battle cruisers 50 miles ahead of the main body of 16 modern battleships. By daylight on the 31st, both the fleets were at sea, and on a collision course. Neither side was fully aware of what the other was doing. Beatty arrived at the rendezvous first and sighted Hipper's ships. They closed at a combined speed of 50 miles per hour and opened fire. It soon became clear that the German gunnery was superior, largely thanks to their stereoscopic rangefinders. 4 out of 6 of Beatty's battle cruisers were badly hit, with one blown up and sunk after a shell penetrated her magazine. Beatty's supporting battleships now arrived and began to pound Hipper, whose ships continued to give as good as they got, sinking another battle cruiser. Both sides launched torpedo attacks with their destroyers, but neither was able to reach the main battle line. Spotting the German main body, Beatty now ended this first phase of what became known as the Battle of Jutland by withdrawing northwards towards Jellicoe and the main British fleet. Von Scheer, unaware that Jellicoe was approaching with 24 battleships to his 16, followed Beatty. Beatty tried to advise Jellicoe of the German position, but his signals were initially misinterpreted. At 6:30 in the evening, when Jellicoe became aware of the German presence, he altered course to try and cut von Scheer off from his base. Von Scheer realized this and himself turned. He headed south into the growing darkness, pursued by the British fleet on a parallel course. This last and critical phase of the Battle of Jutland represents just under 90 minutes of complicated maneuvering and heavy gunfire. When von Scheer initially clashed with Jellicoe, his numerical inferiority quickly began to tell, in spite of superior German gunnery techniques. It was this that forced him to make an early turn. At one point, he was obliged to send in his destroyers, hoping that the threat of their torpedoes would cause Jellicoe to shy away. This was partially successful. By the time Jellicoe renewed his pursuit, von Scheer had managed to get almost out of range. The fading light was also making accurate gunnery more difficult to achieve. It's important to remember that radar did not exist at this time and would not be introduced for more than 20 years. Thus, the human eye was the only means of acquiring targets. This was difficult at night, and navies therefore did not give night gunnery much priority. Even so, the British did continue to engage at long range, but achieved few hits, although they did account for 2 light cruisers at the cost of losing 1 cruiser themselves. Jellicoe too, in a last desperate bid to inflict serious damage on his opponent, sent in his destroyers. They sank the pre-dreadnought battleship Pommern, and another German ship was damaged by a British laid minefield. By daylight on the 1st of June, the Germans were approaching port, secure in the knowledge that they had given the British the slip. The British Grand Fleet also turned for home, believing that it had won a tactical victory. Jellicoe, though, was well aware that he had failed to destroy the German high seas fleet, and also that his losses of 3 battle cruisers and 3 cruisers had been substantially greater than the Germans. Leaving aside the superior German gunnery, these losses had revealed basic flaws in British ship design. In particular, their armor protection was not thick enough, and there was no means of sealing off dangerous parts of the ship, such as the ammunition magazines. Jellicoe soon faced criticism that he had failed to seize a golden opportunity to destroy the enemy battle fleet. But as the Grand Fleet lay at anchor, he was convinced that von Scheer would soon be tempted out again and that the Royal Navy would be able to score a decisive success. The overall result of the Battle of Jutland may not have been clear-cut at the time, but the British Grand Fleet did not have long to wait before von Scheer and the German High Seas Fleet ventured out of port once more. It seemed that the second round of the eagerly anticipated fleet action was about to take place. In August 1916, the Germans made another foray, but this time the action was not nearly as intense as at Jutland, although von Scheer was nearly trapped. Once again, he was able to make good his escape. The High Seas Fleet returned to port and was to remain there for the next 2 years without attempting another sortie. But while the standoff between the two fleets had developed, another naval weapon was beginning to revolutionize the war at sea. The concept of an undersea warship had been in existence for over 3 centuries by 1914. This is a 17th century Dutch design for a submarine. The first true modern submarine was designed by an American, John Holland. His Holland 8, with a crew of 7 and a single bow torpedo tube, entered US naval service in 1903. By the outbreak of the Great War in Europe, American submarines had grown in size, having 4 torpedo tubes and a crew of over 20 men. Other navies initially bought the Holland boat, but then developed their own submarines. By 1914, these were widespread and available in considerable numbers. When the war began, the British had some 70 submarines in service. They were opposed by 37 German U-boats. The navies of 1914 saw the roles of the submarine as reconnaissance, mine-laying, and above all, sinking surface warships. The submarine acquired the target through its periscope, launched its torpedoes, and then dived deep to make its escape. A typical 1914 submarine is this British B-class boat. She had a crew of 15 and 2 bow torpedo tubes. She could, however, only carry 4 torpedoes. In contrast, a hunter-killer submarine of the 1990s has some 8 tubes and can stow about 30 torpedoes. The B-class submarine was capable of a surface speed of 12 knots, about 14 miles an hour, and had a range of 1,000 miles. When underwater, she was powered by electric batteries. The need to recharge these meant that the time she could spend submerged was strictly limited to about 12 hours. In contrast, the modern nuclear-powered submarine can remain underwater for weeks at a time. The submarine's potential was starkly demonstrated on the 22nd of September, 1914, when a single U-boat sank 3 elderly British battleships within the space of an hour off the Dutch coast, with the loss of 1,400 lives. The submarine also began to be used to help blockade the enemy's coasts. The normal method of operating such a blockade was to apprehend merchant vessels and bring them into harbour, where their cargoes would be confiscated. From the outbreak of war, British destroyers were engaged in this activity in the North Sea, stopping any ship which might be heading for Germany. Within a few weeks, they had established a tight cordon from Norway to the English Channel. The latter was blocked by the Dover Barrage, a barrier created by drifters using what were little more than reinforced fishing nets suspended from floats, as can be seen here being repaired and loaded. These were primarily used to prevent U-boats from slipping through the English Channel. The Germans were obliged to rely on neutral shipping, and pre-war international agreements laid down that only certain types of goods could be declared contraband, and a neutral ship had to be bound for an enemy port for its cargo to be seized. The British answer to this was to purchase the cargo compulsorily, and then allow the ship to return to its home port. This avoided loss of life and gave the ship's owners some compensation. The Germans, on the other hand, were in no position to blockade British trade, but they could quite legitimately attack and sink Allied merchant vessels, provided that the safety of their crews was ensured. A number of warships and armed merchant vessels were deployed for this purpose, but most were quickly hunted down and destroyed. One exception was the Merve, shown here, which sank 40 vessels and was not herself sunk until the end of the Second World War. This left the Germans with just the U-boat, but this had limitations. It could not easily escort a vessel into harbour and did not have the manpower to put a prize crew aboard. It also could not guarantee the safety of a captured crew because it had no room on board. On occasion, a U-boat skipper might give a tow to the crew of a sunk vessel, but this made his boat very vulnerable to attack. Usually, the best that could be done was to order the crew into their lifeboats and set them adrift after interrogating the captain, with a course to steer to the nearest land. The U-boat would then sink the ship, preferably by gunfire, in order to preserve torpedoes. From October 1914, this was the practice that the Germans began to adopt. But any surface attack put the U-boat at risk. The alternative was underwater attack, which often meant firing without warning. The Navy pressed for this to be allowed. And in early 1915, the Kaiser reluctantly agreed. In February 1915, the Germans declared a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare in the waters surrounding Britain and Ireland. While every effort would be made not to sink neutral vessels, their safety could not be guaranteed, especially since U-boat skippers were instructed that the safety of their vessel was of prime importance. The Germans, however, hoped that this warning would deter neutral vessels from entering British waters. As the U-boat skippers crossed off entries in the official register of merchant vessels, they began to believe that they had a decisive weapon in their hands. The British made much propaganda about the unrestricted U-boat campaign, claiming that the Germans were ignoring the laws of civilized warfare. Neutrals, on the other hand, regarded it as little worse than having their cargoes confiscated by the British. In reality, this first unrestricted campaign made little immediate impact, since the limited number of U-boats meant that only 2 or 3 could operate against trade at any one time. In May 1915, however, an event took place which was to have serious implications for the German campaign. On the 1st of May, the Cunard passenger liner Lusitania left New York for Liverpool. That same day, the New York papers contained a notice advising that ships flying the British flag risked destruction without any preliminary warning. Six days later, off Southwest Ireland, the ship was sunk by a single torpedo fired by U-20. Of the 2,000 souls aboard her, 1,200 were drowned, including 188 Americans. There was an immediate outcry over this atrocity, both in Britain and the United States, where anger had previously been mainly directed at Britain for her treatment of neutral ships. Yet the Lusitania was carrying contraband goods in the form of explosives and ammunition. Despite the lurid headlines, Americans were soon viewing the incident as another reason for staying out of the war. To use President Wilson's words, America was too proud to fight. Thus the campaign continued for the remainder of 1915, petering out simply because too few U-boats could be maintained at sea at any one time. Even though some 1.3 million gross tons of merchant shipping was lost, some 65% of it British, this had little effect on commerce. But further loss of American lives provoked the American government to a much stiffer reaction. If the Germans did not cease this form of warfare, the United States would have no option but to sever diplomatic relations. Fearful that this might lead to the United States entering the war, the Germans halted the campaign in the Atlantic and North Sea, and merchant shipping losses fell dramatically. Instead, they turned to the Mediterranean, where fewer American ships sailed. Throughout the first unrestricted campaign, the U-boats used did not carry more than 8 torpedoes and had to employ them sparingly. Thus, 80% of the ships sunk were still destroyed by gunfire, with the crews usually being given time to take to their boats. Occasionally, when the U-boat commander felt he was in no immediate danger, charges would be placed on board the vessel and then detonated. Merchant vessels usually traveled singly, and it was difficult to provide them with naval protection, especially if they strayed off the main sea lanes. Taking note of the U-boat surface attacks, the British developed a new anti-submarine weapon, the Q-ship. This was a seemingly innocent merchant vessel which would purposely sail into a U-boat danger area. When a U-boat surfaced, the crew would pretend to panic and often begin to take to the boats. But simultaneously, guns would suddenly appear and deliver a quick barrage at the U-boat. Q-ships enjoyed a number of successes, occasionally even capturing a U-boat. But by 1917, the U-boat commanders had begun to grow too wily for them. In August 1916, with the decision to keep the High Seas Fleet in port, the question of unrestricted submarine warfare was re-examined by the German government and High Command. The British blockade of Germany was becoming ever tighter, and the attempt to bleed France white at Verdun was clearly failing. This, together with the Battle of the Somme, was dissipating German military strength. On the other hand, the rate of U-boat construction had been rapidly rising, and this was reflected in a parallel increase in ship sinkings during the second half of 1916. Given enough U-boats, the German naval staff argument ran, British commerce could be so crippled their enemy would be forced to sue for peace. One factor above all others, however, caused a delay in coming to a decision. Throughout 1916, President Wilson had been putting out feelers to both sides in the hope of being able to broker a peace. There was to be a presidential election in November 1916, and much depended on its outcome and the new president's attitude to Germany's terms for peace. Wilson was re-elected, but not until the end of December did he make it clear that he did not accept Germany's peace proposals. Consequently, in early January 1917, the Germans resolved on a wholesale, unrestricted submarine campaign, with neutral ships being given no leeway. At the beginning of this new campaign, which began on the 1st of February 1917, some 110 U-boats were in commission. The boats were of two types: large ocean-going boats shown here, operating from the German North Sea ports, and shorter-range coastal boats based on Belgian ports. But the British now had a number of new weapons, besides surface ships, nets and Q-ships, which were losing their effectiveness. Hydrophones could detect a U-boat's engine under the surface, provided it was close to the ship. The drogue towed behind the vessel acted as the earpiece, with the operator listening out for the telltale sounds by sweeping with his dial to pinpoint them. Depth charges, mines launched from surface vessels and set to explode at certain depths, had been developed, although production of them was slow. The usual indication of a successful depth charge attack was the oil driven up by the force of the explosion. Air power, too, was beginning to be used. Flying boats and float planes could attack U-boats with torpedoes, bombs, and machine guns. Airships, too, with up to 1,500 miles range and nearly 50 hours endurance, could help locate U-boats. Unfortunately, they proved impractical as attack platforms, since they were too unstable for any form of accuracy. Instead, they would direct surface ships to the sea. In spite of all these new weapons and methods of locating submarines, the U-boats succeeded in sinking no less than 500 ships during February and March 1917, and sailings of neutral ships in the Eastern Atlantic and North Sea fell by 75%. Even though conditions on board the U-boats were often unpleasant, especially because of the battery fumes, the morale of the crews rose with every success they had. One reason for the upsurge in sinkings was that the new types of U-boat coming off the slipways carried twice as many torpedoes as their predecessors. Another, though, was the traditional Royal Navy strategy of attack. Offensive patrols were sent out to sweep the main sea routes, but the U-boats merely sat on the fringes, waited for the patrols to pass, and then pounced on their prey. Some U-boat skippers began to achieve staggering totals of ships sunk. As they returned to port after successful cruises, they became national heroes. This was something that would be repeated 25 years later during the Second Battle of the Atlantic. If sinkings continued at this high rate, it was clear that it would not be long before Britain began to starve, and to ward this off, strict food rationing had to be instituted. Even on the Western Front, troops were reminded of the need not to waste food. The U-boat menace and the continuing bloody stalemate on land made the first part of 1917 a gloomy time for France and Britain. Some good for the Allies did, however, emerge from these grim 2 months. 2 days after the opening of the campaign, President Wilson, as he had threatened almost a year earlier, severed diplomatic relations with Germany. Two months later, on the 2nd of April 1917, after the Germans had shown no signs of easing their campaign, both houses of Congress assembled to hear President Wilson tell them that he believed that America could no longer remain on the sidelines. Both houses overwhelmingly voted in his favor. On the 6th, war against Germany was declared. Now the US Navy could help in eradicating the U-boat menace. Yet ships, aircraft and airships on their own were not enough. The concept of anti-submarine warfare had to be rethought, and urgently. The main solution to overcoming the U-boat threat came in the form of a technique used by navies for centuries. Gathering merchant vessels together and sailing them as convoys with armed escorts had proved very successful in past wars, but in this conflict it was seen as too defensive and difficult to organize. Nevertheless, its effectiveness was soon proved, with only 5 out of 800 ships convoyed during July and August 1917 being lost. But this was not all. The Americans and British began to construct an enormous minefield. This used new and more effective mines and ran from the Orkneys to Norwegian territorial waters. The northern mine barrage made it more difficult for U-boats to get into the Atlantic. This ambitious project was carried out between March and October 1918 and involved the laying of more than 70,000 mines. More spectacular was the British attempt in April 1918 to deny the U-boats the use of Zeebrugge on the Belgian coast. Up until now, operations in these waters had consisted mainly of clashes between light craft, including destroyers. There were also bombardments of the coast. These employed ungainly monitors, which were little more than platforms for large guns, like the 15-inch type seen here on HMS Erebus. They and their supporting craft regularly exchanged fire with German coastal batteries. The attack on Zeebrugge on the 23rd of April 1918 involved sinking 3 block ships across the harbour entrance. This was successful. Their escorting cruiser, the Vindictive, was lucky, however, to get back to port. Even so, the U-boat still managed to find a way through. Nevertheless, these new tactics meant that by early 1918, the U-boat threat had been brought under control. This was vital, not just for Britain's survival, but to enable American troops to be transported across the Atlantic to France and provide the tide that would turn the battered fortunes of the Allies. In contrast, the Allied blockade of the Central Powers had progressively become tighter. The British Grand Fleet and the United States Atlantic Fleet had now produced a combined force of such strength that any lingering thoughts that the German High Seas Fleet might still have about bringing the Allies to battle were quickly dispelled. By summer 1918, the Allies had won the war at sea. The decisive battle on land remained still to be fought.